Hey, welcome back. In this video, I wanted to just give a few really quick thoughts, just really quick, on this comment, this sort of comment that I see made pretty often on this channel and on similar channels when it comes to the discussion of this topic, discussing some of the implications of creating human beings, of having babies. Like, what does that mean to do it? In particular, I uploaded a video pretty recently entitled, "Oh my God, I'm having a baby." And I just gave a few thoughts on this very common sort of thing that I hear many people say. And the gist of the video was just, well, if you're having a baby, if you're going to have a baby, you should keep in mind that you're not just having a baby, you're bringing about something a lot more complicated and complex and consequential and those sorts of words. When you're having a baby, you're doing that because the baby, nowadays, babies make it all the way to adulthood. You know, that's the thing that babies tend to do, especially in places like this where I am right now. Babies, oh my God, it's never been like an easier time to voluntarily bring an embryo or like just a conception all the way to the developmental, the complexity of an adult, like the fully developed human being. It's never been easier to voluntarily bring that about, to bring just a tiny, because all throughout human history, babies would die at just way more rapid rates. The mortality rate for little infants, half the people wouldn't make it past the age of 6, like not even that long ago, relatively speaking, and all throughout human history. So nowadays, when you're having a baby, you're doing a lot more than just having a baby. Used to, maybe you are just having a baby because like it would probably die. Like babies would die way more often. But nowadays, yes, you're having something a lot more than just a baby because that's what it's going to eventually become. Because that's what happens when babies don't die. They grow up into adults. That tends to be what happens. And I just gave some thoughts on this reminder, because people do already know that if they are to have babies, that's what's going to happen, but people don't really process it. And the degrees at which people process it, that's going to vary a lot, but really none of us are capable of fully processing the fact that if we are to have a baby, it's going to become an adult. Like to really have an appreciation for that, I would argue, is impossible for like anybody. But man, a lot of people that are doing that are like, practically, psychologically speaking, like they're just children. Like you have many 21-year-olds, and I don't know. I think back to that time, and I'm trying to, but even at that time, like many 21-year-olds, they're not children in many ways, but they're stupid as shit, a lot of them. And many people my age are stupid as shit. And I'm stupid as shit in all sorts of varying ways. But just the degree at which so many people that are having babies are stupid as shit, in the sense that they're not really thinking about what it is that they're doing. And that's terrifying to contemplate. But the comment itself, I wanted to give a few thoughts on a sort of comment that I see pretty often on videos like that. The comment, the gist is just the claim that when it comes to this topic and the discussion of it, many people don't feel comfortable talking about it. They don't feel like they're able to have these sorts of discussions with most people. Like in that comment, that video itself, those sorts of comments that were left, a lot of them, and a lot of people liked and agreed with them, that this is a topic that is not very often discussed, and most people aren't able to wrap their heads around it. Most people aren't able to have they'll look at you like you're kind of crazy if you start talking about the fact that creating a person, you're doing a lot more than just having a baby when you're having a baby, and those sorts of very obvious things that are just unavoidably true, because it is. And I guess in particular, when it came to that video, I mentioned how when you're having a baby, you're creating a person that will eventually suffer quite severely and will desperately cling to justification for their continued suffering. And they'll gradually be crushed between this this rock and a hard place of severe suffering and aversion to death, desperate desire for continued existence. And that's something that you'll find in many human beings. That's what keeps many people alive. And that's a pretty horrifying thing, to be just continually dragged on by the inevitable marching on of time. And that's what's dragging you on, is just inability to take your own life, or a very, very powerful aversion to death. And that's what keeps many people breathing. And that's horrifying if you take a moment to think about that. And that's true as well. That is the case. And these are things that I think many people do know. I mean, they know them to be true. It's just when it comes to really attempting to have more of an appreciation for the truth that exists in them, that's where many people are severely lacking, especially most of the people that are having babies. And I think it is worth mentioning that a healthy mind isn't necessarily an accurate mind. A contented mind isn't necessarily an honest mind. I feel that's worth considering, at least, because I'm in a good mood most of the time. Most of the time, I feel very, very distant from what it really truly means to be a human being on planet Earth. For the majority of human beings on planet Earth, I feel very, very distant from that. And I'm very, very grateful for that, because if I did have an appreciation for that, I would be not a very happy camper on planet Earth myself. And I care about my own happiness, so I'd rather not dwell on those sorts of things. But you have more and more people failing to even briefly consider those sorts of things, and this is resulting in more and more people treating the creation of additional human beings as though it's just really not all that big of a deal. And I don't know, I feel like this topic, you can talk about it with most people, I think. It just depends on the way in which you go about discussing it. It's not something that's just going to come up. It's not something like in small talk. You should, you got to kind of pay attention to social cues and whatnot. But I mean, the fact that having a baby, you're doing something that is beyond comprehensible. You're doing something way more than just that. That's something that people already know. It's just, trying to get them to process it a bit more. And I think when it's talked about in that way, like, oh, most people can't wrap their heads around it, it sounds, I don't know if that's the intention, but it sounds pretty self-righteous. It's not, it is something that most people can wrap their heads around. It's just that it's not a comfortable thing to really think too thoroughly about. It's a very uncomfortable sort of thing to really attempt to process. And there are a lot of truths. There are a lot of truths that we just sort of take for granted. Things that we know to be true, like the inevitability of our own deaths as individual human beings. Our own subjective lives are going to come to an end before we know it. And this is really uncomfortable, to say the least. It's a really uncomfortable truth. But when people fail in reflecting on that, I think that leads to far more suffering, certainly in the long run. Definitely in the long run. I think you become far more likely to shoot yourself in the foot out of arrogance and just ignorance. You're not going to have an appreciation for the risk involved in just, being a human being. And you have many people that are very self-destructive in all sorts of varying ways. And one very common way in which many miserable people will attempt to, I wouldn't say self-destruct, but it's more of like a gradual thing. But many people throw caution to the wind when it comes to casual sex. And then that leading to the creation of a person. And then just like the whole, throughout that portion of time, they're very passive in the way in which they go about, like, all right, I guess I'm having a baby. And that, I think, is a very common form of self-destruction, of becoming of conceiving with someone that you really, not only did you not really know them all that well, but you were quite miserable with, and they treat you quite badly, and then you're gonna have their baby or their babies, and I see that pretty often, and that's not good. That's really not good. I mean, holy shit. But I think when it comes to those sorts of origin stories of human beings, people creating people, and a lot of it being quite self-destructive and inflicting just incomprehensible amounts of suffering for what looks to be no real good justification there. I don't know. I think that this topic is something that can be discussed with most people. It just depends on the way in which you try to discuss it. Which, it's a very difficult, that's a way more difficult question to attempt to answer. What is the best way of discussing these sorts of things to where you're trying to get like the average person that stands to have a baby or have babies with someone that they really should not go about doing that with, and you're trying to get them to just consider it and avoid those sorts of predicaments, very common predicaments. But yeah, that's. I just want to talk about that. I guess the main thoughts being that when it comes to this topic, the discussion of it, and the fact that when you're having a baby, you're doing something way more than just having a baby. I think you can talk about it with most people, and you should try to do that. It's not entirely futile. I just think it depends on the way in which you go about doing it. And yes, that's about it. I think I just wanted to talk about that a little bit. But I don't know, I think there's a lot of middle ground to be reached there for that reason. The fact that, because most people know, and most people will agree that the fact that many people do treat the creation of people as though it's a joke is not good. It's just a lot of the disagreement's going to be on what are some factors that are going into that? Like, what are some common catalysts that are going into that? And then you get into like the nature nurture debates and those sorts of very foundational disagreements between parties, between but the vast majority of people do agree with that, I think, and they're able to wrap their heads around it, I think. And you throw in all sorts of other things like religiosity and how many people believe in, like, how restricted is our free will if we have it at all. I don't believe that we do at all. I struggle to see how we could. I mean, when you see the ways in which, I don't know if you've ever met people, I don't know if you ever like walked around a Walmart before, but the idea that all of these human beings walking around and coming out of the womb and doing all the sorts of things that human beings out of the womb go on to do, and you see what that often consists of in terms of experience, in terms of behavior, human behavior, in terms of all these things. I don't understand how you could believe that isn't anything other than very, very deterministic, very fatalistic. It doesn't. That doesn't look to be something that. There's not a whole lot of choice, not genuine choice, if there is at all. There's no real. Many people are just entirely confined by their genetic predispositions and environmental conditions, and there's just, you can't really escape that. I know it might feel like you yourself, it feels like I have free will, like very strongly. That's something that really, it's a very, very stubborn, if it is an illusion, it feels like a very stubborn one. But when you look at like many human beings, if you attempt to look outside of yourself for a moment and consider what it must be like to be a lot of human beings on planet Earth, and you consider it from their perspective, that doesn't look to be something that isn't entirely confined by cause and effect outside of factors that were in place already before the time of conception.